Hello again, OCAC. As we dig into the sermon today, let's enter in with a prayerful attitude and let's bow our hearts. Lord, as we enter into today's sermon, we just pray that you will provide new insight and new context and new wisdom to us. And as we dig into your word, God, I pray, Lord, that we will be blessed and that you will be glorified throughout the rest of this sermon. So today, I'm picking back up in our series, Back to the Basic. Our topic of discussion today is obedience. Now, I want to introduce you to a few people. The first person is someone that you may know or may not know very well. He is roguishly handsome, probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. He is a legendary nap taker and the occasional snack gourmet. Now, for those of you who follow me on Instagram, you'll know that's what my profile says. And I've attached a picture of how I sometimes like to see myself for reference. Sometimes I'm a superhero. That's what I tell myself, at least. Now, the second person I want to introduce you to is someone that you probably know much better. He also is well known for his sense of humor, and as of late, I've really gotten to know him and admired him for his intelligence and also for his love of the Lord. Now, this is Cheung. Now, this is the picture of me in an ABC in Hawaii. For context, this delicious yellow slop that I've piled up is Dole Whip. And so basically what that is it's this like mixture of pineapple juice and ice cream, and it's delicious. And basically it's what I think all the water slides in heaven are filled with. And, it's simply the best thing I've ever had in my life. And I would probably eat it every day if I had a chance. Now, the store that this picture was taken in has a sign where it says you pay a certain amount, you get a bowl. Now, it doesn't state how much you can fill up that bowl or how little you can put in it. All it says is that you get a bowl for a certain price. After filling it up, I kind of went up to the cashier and she turned her head sideways and she laughed and shook her head incredulously and just said, "Congratulations, young man, that's quite impressive." Now, the reason I've decided to show you this picture today is that it's an accurate representation of the way that sometimes I approach the topic of obedience. Where some see common sense and say, well, obviously you only get to fill the bowl a certain amount. Others might say, actually, you only get the bowl and it doesn't actually say you get any Dole Whip that goes with it. I saw something that was open to interpretation. And when I see something that is open to interpretation, I generally push the boundaries of what is or isn't allowed, just because, if I'm being honest, I'm curious, which is kind of a nice way of saying I'm also a rebel. Now, if you want to fact check me on this, you could talk to my wife, you could talk to the kids in the student ministry. Anyone who's known me for over 2 hours will probably agree or attest to that fact. Now, remember Cheung? He's a graduating student from this year's Jeremiah Fellowship. For those of you who don't know Cheung, he's attending Royal Military College in Kingston next year. He's part of the Canadian Armed Forces, and his understanding of the word obedience is probably slightly different than you or I. His commanding officer says jump, Cheung says how high. His commanding officer tells him to hold his breath. Cheung does it till he turns blue. His commanding officer hands him a shovel and tells him to dig. Cheung doesn't stop until he's told to stop. Now, on the theme of obedience, there's one more person I want to talk to you about today. His name is Gideon. I'm sure it's a story that you've heard many times over in Sunday school and in Sunday service, but I hope that today will gain that there will be new potential insight, and it'll hopefully be relevant to us on the topic of obedience. So let's dig in here. Now, perhaps it would be helpful to recall the overall context. As his story is found in the book of Judges, it would be helpful to remember what just happened, and so that we can see the context of where we pick up our story. In just one chapter previous, which is chapter 5, it describes the song of Deborah, a song that gives praise to God for his aid in defeating the Canaanites. If we were to do away with the chapter division and simply just move on, from the exaltation of Deborah's praise poem to the bold statement in which chapter 6 opens, we should at least be shocked in seeing the spiritual perspective in which Gideon appears. If we do not understand why Gideon was raised up and why God's dealings with him were recorded in the form that we have them today, we simply cannot make much progress in understanding their relevance to us today. Now, in most books and films, there's an apex to the story. Many of the questions lead up to how we got there, and the rest of the movie usually ends up in how that apex gets resolved. In some movies, it's simple. John Wick goes on a rampage because he loses his dog. In Jaws, the whole movie's based on a shark. You get what I mean. But the book of Judges is different. It all seems so circular. Israel sins. Israel is oppressed. Israel cries out to God. God raises up a judge. Israel is delivered. And everything's all good, right up until that judge dies. But that's only part of the story. The diagram we see is actually only a 2D model. It doesn't really show the complete story. The reality of this book of Judges is that it's more of a downward spiral, an ever-deepening vortex for which each fresh transgression against God, the oppression seems to deepen, either in length or intensity or both. And each time a leader is raised up, he seems to be more flawed than the last one, a process which develops through the entire book and finally peaks at Samson. Now, when there's a pattern in literary works, we're supposed to notice them. Similarly, things are not just repeated in scripture for no reason. So although Gideon becomes an esteemed hero of faith, that's not to say he's perfect. He keeps with the pattern of the other judges by ultimately ending up worse than where he started. So follow along the story with me. Open up your Bibles to the book of Judges, starting in chapter 6. So Judges chapter 6, starting from verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded this country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel. Neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them on their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Does this seem like it's an unusually cruel of God to allow his people to be defeated and plundered again and again? Now that small phrase at the beginning of this passage in verse 1 is the defining factor by which we know that this is not the mark of a cruel God, but discipline. Let me explain. God's discipline is a feature of his love, and it's only by allowing us to taste the consequence of our sin that we are capable of learning to hate it. I'll show you what I mean with a video that'll help me explain this a little bit better.
Experiment 2. The food is connected to a mild electrical current. The hamster has learned a valuable lesson. Beware the hand of man. Wise guy, eh? Ow! 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 Hamster 2, Bart 0.
For those of you who have not seen this video before, I think we would all agree that no one is shocking Bart Simpson. He is, by his own stubbornness, putting himself in the same situation over and over again because what sits in front of him is so enticing. You know, it's by our own stubbornness and sinfulness that we continue to return to the same mistakes we make over and over again. God is trying to teach us that it's by our own disobedience that we encounter destitution. See, the thing with God is that he always has the long-term gains in view, holiness and righteousness. Children, like me, who rebel so often do so with increasing outrageousness just because they're desperately pleading for the line to be drawn somewhere, for someone to love them enough to just say no. That's how God's motivation of love often works in the lives of his immature children, also like myself. Of course, we need to be careful not to oversimplify and just say all adversity is discipline. But when we face a prolonged period of difficulty, such as, say, 7 years in verse 1, it should be at the very least, it should make us stop and examine our ways. Is this self-inflicted friendly fire? Or is this God's discipline? Maybe somewhere in between, a mixture of both. I don't know, but that's probably something that they should have been thinking about. Now, the people who had been given this land by the Lord, who created it and owned it all, were reduced to hiding themselves in caves in the barren and inhospitable hill country. Even there, they felt insecure and were forced into building fortified strongholds because they just had no answer to the marauding forces of Midian. Living in dens and caves like animals and repeatedly losing their crops and their own livestock without hope of recovery. It doesn't take a lot to imagine that wave after wave of this destruction year after year, what it does to the Israelites' morale. They would try to recover and plant crops, only for them to be plundered again. It got so bad that they had to actually try to hide the food they had so it wouldn't get plundered anymore. It took them 7 years, to finally cry out to God for deliverance. It only leads us to a natural line of questioning. In our lives, if I'm in pain, the first question I would want to ask God is why? I want some form of rational explanation for my pain. I want to understand it. But note what it says in the next passage in Judges 6:11-16. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the land bring us out of Egypt? Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, Go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Now, I'm going through this passage. I want us to notice a few things. Gideon is going through such lengths to hide that he's actually threshing wheat in a winepress. Let me explain that to you. Now, threshing is the process by which people can remove the grain from their husks before milling it into flour. And so usually a threshing floor is out in the open where they would have had oxen to help with the process. But Gideon is doing this in a winepress, which would normally have been underground or even in a cave to keep the juice from the winepress cool. Gideon had some hard questions. Why has all of this happened to us? Now, one thing I want us to appreciate here, it's important to note the sense of detachment between cause and effect. Gideon is totally blind to this. He's failed to equate disobedience with the bad things that are happening around him. And the Lord turns to him and says, "Finally, someone's turning to me. I'm going to send you to save your nation." And Gideon immediately responds with excuses. Maybe you've made a mistake. I'm a part of a weak clan. You can't use me, right? Let me translate this. Here I am. Send that guy. Sounds like us, doesn't it? I want a solution, but send someone else to do it for me. I want a solution, but only if it's easy. Now, to be fair, on the surface, there's nothing special whatsoever about Gideon when he's called. His faith is far from robust. His courage is minimal, his lineage apparently non-existent. However, in many ways, Gideon is the perfect person to do this. He embodies the fate of the whole nation. Defeatist, hopeless, puny, and unassuming. Ouch. Now, being found in this state of distress, it's no wonder that we see Gideon react the way that he does. Life has taken a pretty bad turn for him and for Israel. They're beaten, they're afraid, They're hiding in caves. It's no wonder that Gideon is so uncertain of the things that he sees, that he hears, that he knows that God commands of him. Now, let's move forward to Judges chapter 6, verse 17 to 22. Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and I set it before you." And the Lord said, "All right, I'll wait until you return." So Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Now, many of us relate well to Gideon because we too find our lack of resources all too obvious. We are constantly comparing ourselves and will often feel so inferior. The danger is that we develop a false modesty, which can soon lead to a total lack of vision. When God places conviction in our hearts, we'd better take him seriously because he knows what he's doing. We as a church are together as a body because God has put us here. God calls not only the pastors, but the members to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We can all spend plenty of time analyzing one another's weaknesses and inspecting our own deficiency. Let's be honest here, my list alone would fill the entire sermon. But in the end, it detracts from the commission that is given to us. Now, for Gideon, the implications here are overwhelming, life-changing even. It isn't unreasonable for him to want to know that what he's heard is really the voice of God. He doesn't approach this concept blindly. He's uncertain. He's second-guessing it. He needs to be sure. And the most wonderful part of this story is that God doesn't write him out of the script for that or accuse him of unbelief. He's patient. He says, "All right, go ahead, get your things." And perhaps here's the healthy skepticism that we need to learn. Something that we covered in our spiritual retreat with the student ministry this year was on the topic of, well, how do I know if God's talking to me or if it's something else that's nudging me towards whatever? To sum it up, the better we know his voice, the more familiar it becomes. We have freedom to ask if we're not sure, because if God wants it done, he's patient with us. He'll tell us again or confirm it to us through a friend. So let's continue on in Gideon's story to see what happens next. Let's move down to verse 25 here. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal. Cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. Offer the second bull as a burnt offering." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar, demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. Now, although Gideon has been convinced that this is the angel of the Lord, he's still not necessarily confident in what he must do. Gideon's commanded to go, chop down the idols, break down this altar on his father's property. Not only that, but he's called to use that wood to sacrifice a burnt offering to the Lord. And lastly, he's commanded to build an altar to God directly on top of the remains of where the idol used to be. You would think that after having such a miraculous encounter with God, he would be emboldened to do his commands. Instead, the account says that Gideon was afraid of his family and the townspeople, and so he got 10 other guys to go do it with him, and he did it at night where it'd be harder to see who had done the deed. Now, even if we're convinced that we're following the commands of God that God has laid out for us, it doesn't necessarily mean that we must be confident in how we do it or when we do it. Obedience is not about following God's commands confidently. Obedience is obeying God's command despite our lack of confidence. So whether you do what God tells you in broad daylight or you're a little bit scared to do it, all that matters is that you do it. Not everyone is designed to stand on a soapbox in the middle of Rito Street and preach God's word. But the good news is that we don't actually necessarily have to do that either. Now, let's skip forward and we'll move down to verse 33 and see what happens next. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too would went up to meet them. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. But this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." And that night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. And perhaps this is where we find ourselves today, right now. Over the course of the past year, our spiritual walk has likely taken a hit amidst the inability to see each other face to face. The process of belief and obedience isn't always a Tyrion situation, but be encouraged that it doesn't have to be a Pastor Anthony situation either. One person may simply hear the command and obey it. Another person may themselves go through a downward spiral of self-inflicted friendly fire, much like the Israelites did in the book of Judges. At times, we will all question why God has allowed something bad to happen to us. At times, we will all face the reality of God calling us to obedience. Even in the process of obeying God, we may still have doubts, and that's okay. Whether we like to admit it or not, it is normal for us to be somewhere on the spectrum of obeying God. But let's not stop there. This is exactly why God has given us this community, the church, to help us along that spectrum. Some of us might be asking for a miraculous confirmation that we're on the right track. God's given us something so much better, a real, live, working church that can encourage us. Now, I don't want to leave us on the edge of our seats. Once Gideon receives his confirmation, he is spurred on to carry God's will with more confidence. Perhaps others have heard about this woolen fleece experience and were emboldened. But it says that Gideon was able to conscript approximately 32,000 men. So beginning in chapter 7, starting in verse 1, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. They would say, 'My own strength has saved me.' Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So on the spot, 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water. I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. And there the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from their cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. We know the rest of the story here. With this fighting force, God says to Gideon, "I know my children. I know their penchant for pride. I know that they will say that they did this on their own strength. Go ahead and start making some cuts for me." For those scared of battle, Gideon relieves of duty. Gideon's army is whittled down by over 50%. Still too many men. Gideon is then instructed to select men for his army, strictly based on how they choose to drink water. If it appears arbitrary to us, that's because it is. At least if we try to look at it with our own logic and understanding. But God knows what he's doing. By the time Gideon goes to war, his army is left with 300 men, an impossible number to win any battle. And that's the point. Gideon goes on to obliterate the Midian army and revel in the celebration that follows. Now, the story continues with Gideon asking his soldiers for a small share of the gold from their plunder, which he fashions into an ephod, which is a priestly garment to set up in his hometown. He goes on to detail how all of Israel prostituted themselves there by worshiping it and not God. And this is where the simplest and deepest lesson lies for us. So often we are convinced that we have gotten by with our own abilities. So often we think we have earned the good things that happen in our lives. We quickly and conveniently forget that just like Gideon, we were begging for an explanation for our woes not one chapter ago. We must realize that any perceived bad comes from disobedience from God. We are the authors of our own misfortune. God is not some cosmic boogeyman looking to bonk us on our heads at any given time because we disobey. He's a loving Father that disciplines us when we disobey so that we can learn to associate that bitter taste of our misfortunes with the absolute wrong of disobedience. He's not looking for a way to cast us out of his presence. Instead, he's a loving Father that seeks to commune with his people on an ordinary, everyday basis. Now, I'll close this sermon today by leaving you with a quote from Arthur E. Kundal. He's an Old Testament professor at London Bible College, and he writes, "Perhaps it's easier to honor God in some courageous action in the limelight of a time of national emergency than it is to honor him consistently in the ordinary, everyday life, which requires a different kind of courage." And this is where our daily struggle plays such a vital part in our development. It is easy to be the hero of faith when extremely difficult situations arise. It's what's expected. But to honor God in the ordinary, everyday life requires much more discipline. It requires all of us to be the daily exemplar of obedience in our respectful lives. God's word is speaking to us as a church on a daily basis. Cast down your pride, put aside our egos, and simply obey him, even when it seems difficult. So, don't try to go where the Spirit of God doesn't lead you. Don't try to claim credit for the accomplishments that occur in our life because we don't earn it. Don't try to deny God the glory when things begin to look good for us. And, obeying God one big time can't be our end goal. As Christians, we seek to follow God every day. Now, I hope that we can be encouraged and strive for this lifestyle.